Shall we start? Yeah. So Rahiim Fortune, born in 1994, was raised in Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, the federally recognized Native American tribe. His post-documentary photo practice focuses on culture, geography, and self-expression in the American landscape. He currently lives and works between Austin, Texas, and Brooklyn, New York. His first book, I Can't Stand See You Cry, was published this year and was already shortlisted for one of the most important awards of photography, the Paris Photo Aperture, of the same year. So I would like to start with the title, actually. I Can't Stand to See You Cry. I was wondering does it come from and who is the you referring to?
Yes, the title actually refers to a song title. It's a soul song that I was listening to quite a bit while working on this project. And the project kind of follows the deterioration of my father's health after a terminal diagnosis. So he was a funk musician and soul musician, and so listening to those songs kind of brought me back to his youth. And kind of brought a stronger connection with my father. And I think that around the time of the book, it was also while I was working on the project, given the pandemic, given some of the civil unrest that was unfolding, there was a bit of collective trauma and grief that people were feeling. And so the term "I can't stand to see you cry" is almost referring to this idea of I can't stand to see you cry, but it's almost inevitable at this time. And we're all working to maybe see what we can do with that. But also maybe in particular thinking about my grandmother's grief of being much older in her age, being a child of the early 40s segregated Virginia, and seeing her son, her favorite son's health deteriorating. And I feel as though my grandmother, she held on just to make sure that we were good as my father was dealing with his illness, because she passed away just 1 year after, almost in rhythm of holding on. So the "I can't stand to see you cry" refers to kind of the inability to affect the hurt that is going on is a bit of the title, but it all comes from one song that is very connected to my youth, and so it is a bit of like sonic experience of audio, history, and woven narratives within one piece, which was a soul ballad, but the book can function very much the same way.
Yeah, in fact, I saw in the book a very musical rhythm in the way you mixed portraits of people that you encountered after many years, images of rundown buildings, scars, medical equipment that are vaguely reminiscent of Larry Sultan's and Mike Mandel evidence, cowboys and horses, and you described that it's a sort of fantasy version of your hometown, and I was wondering if you could tell us more about your choices in composing the book. In the sense, is this like a huge body of work, and this is just a fragment of your practice, or how did you go about composing the book?
Yes, to me, this was a little bit more of a completed story for me, given that the most serious through line of the work would be my connection to Texas, and also my father, who was kind of the source of my connection to Texas. I kind of knew that the project would, in a way, be over when he passed away. So there was a bit more of that, but I guess it is, the book is somewhat representative of my black and white photography practice, which I am also, a working journalist as well. I work as, reportage and assignment photography. So that background is a bit more than just fine art. So that also kind of plays into just shaping narratives. But yeah, I guess this book is a little bit more, a bit autobiographical, but also kind of looking at some of the commonalities, especially being here in Paris and hearing about some of the reception to it from a non-American audience has given me a bit more of a glimpse into some of the more universal themes that I wasn't akin to because it is so personal to me. So Yeah, I mean, I guess to answer the question, to me, this is a completed body of work. That's not something that is like really free flowing. I am kind of moved past this because this was a very painful project to work on.
I can imagine. And so I was reading about you in the New Yorker, and it appears that you are a self-taught photographer, but correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this is information that I got from the press, and the press, we know, can lie a lot. Um, so, and then, you know, suddenly you find yourself published, shortlisted, having museum shows, etc. Maybe, you know, your surname brings good luck, because fortune in Italian is good luck. But I wonder, you know, obviously all this attention comes with pressure. So I wonder, what are you working on next?
Yes. So I've, I was making photos for a very long time before I was necessarily getting attention for them. And also I worked as a commercial assistant for a long time. So it wasn't kind of like I just was thrown into it. It was a little bit of an understanding of really kind of chipping away and working your way up and eventually kind of your work growing to where maybe others who had maybe before ignored it or were aware of you but weren't necessarily that tuned into the work. I feel as though this project really helped to capture that attention. But with that being said, I feel as though my practice was a little bit more mature, even though I am still young, rather than if it had just, this was the first thing I made. So this was, very much like just a small part of everything that I've worked on in totality. And I had one previous book that was self-published, and that which was shown at the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so what I'm working on next, without giving too much of it away, is, so this project was very much before traveling out to photograph anywhere. This is actually my first time out of the country, so I've never made photographs outside the US, outside of where I grew up. And I felt that it was important to find that language at home before going out and using another subject as an almost test dummy, experimenting with these people and their narrative, but doing that at my home first. So now I carry the same care as I photographed my nephew, who is kind of this first image of him kind of easing his way into from boyhood to manhood, is how I look at young people everywhere. It's how I look at elders, the same care I gave when I looked at my father and his ailment and my grandmother in her final years is the same care that I have kind of for the elders as I go out. And so this next project is kind of going from my home life, and it shifts a little bit out into the culture of Texas and Black Southern culture, and a little bit of a joyous and kind of celebration of, and finding a bit of places where this true energy still exists, where things have become quite homogenous and technical. I am finding a slower pace of life in making a practice that is kind of in conversation with the archive, but also the history of exploitation of the American South.
And how are you finding Europe and Paris in particular? Was it a cultural shock, or?
It's a culture shock. The infrastructure here is much better than in the States. Also, I live in New York part-time, and so our subways can be hit or miss. And so the metro here is a bit cleaner, and there's a vending machine. So that really impressed me. You would never see a vending machine on a subway in New York. And if you did, it wouldn't be stocked or functioning. But yeah, so I've been finding Europe quite great. Everyone has been very, very nice, and I'm really appreciating getting a view of photography and the way that work is explored outside of the context of the US, where things are so very much in a pressure chamber and volatile. So I've noticed that the culture is a bit more about the images, where in the US it is very much about the author and the narrative.
That's very interesting that you say that. And so what do you think that brought you to photography from your childhood experiences?
Great question, great question. It was almost looking for a sense of proof of my existence. You know, growing up in a mixed family, Black and Native, in the South, divorced parents, siblings from different marriages. Nothing about the images I saw in pop culture really represented that experience. Even this images that I would see of this idea of the Black community, Black family, was very often homogenous and also kind of centered in either like patriarchy or American exceptionalism. And so I didn't see too many representations of my lived experience. And so through work like Dawood Bey, LaToya Frazier, who really exemplify this idea of the kind of beautiful dysfunction of American family dynamics. That was what really drew me to photography. So I was often looking for metaphors or references or the ability to kind of articulate the way that I viewed both my family, my community, and showing the beauty, but also their ability to fantasize as well, in that it doesn't have to just be this rigorous truth, but that if we want to be the, instead of it being like some famous photographer making a representation of us, like we can have fun too. And there's a little bit more authorship in that way, I hope, in my work, versus kind of where I often pull reference from, which is kind of classic documentary photography and journalistic aesthetics, but a little bit more transparency with the subjects and the audience.
Thank you very much.
I thought it was very important to include a photograph of myself, because often you'll see these exotic bodies of work and you're like, what does the photographer look like? And it's almost as if they hide themselves. And so it's very important to appear on the cover fully transparent that, yes, this is me in contrast to the people that I photograph. And I thought that that was important because there aren't that many books being produced in the South where that is the case.
Thank you so much. I would like to open it up to the audience and see if there is any questions. It's a very shy audience today.
Please.
Maybe you're getting tired, guys. Come on.
Festival, so I would love if anyone
No questions? Well, okay. I'll ask you a question. Because in a way, I was wondering, not everybody has the talent, but also the lack of, making the first book and it goes viral and it's so well received. I wonder what would be your advice to your peers that are struggling so much to get their work noticed.
Yes, I mean, there's really no one fix. I guess the whole thing is about continuing to trudge on, because even if you gain notoriety, there's still moments where you're going to have that feeling as well. Also, where maybe that feeling is more amplified because there's the pressure of a follow-up or things like that. So that feeling of initially trying to, I guess, get your work, it kind of becomes forms of different battles. And I'm also very young in this, so I don't want to speak too broadly as I'm gaining experience. But for me, what I've always realized is that when I place the pressure on the quality of the work and the rigor of the work and separate the outside audience, that is where the best advancement comes from, but also kind of recognizing that every part of the work is not just with the camera, but also reading, talking to people, examining your motives, getting influence, and working through internalizing parts of the photography industry in a negative way to where they kind of affect who you are or bring you down, because that's also something that maybe isn't spoken about as much, in the way that things can feel so large or pretentious and elitist and you can't get in, and finding a way to make work and interact with that establishment that does not anger you or kind of corrupt you in a way. So finding your balance, how do you want to interact with this whole universe? Because for me, that's been a big learning curve. It's just finding out how to kind of come into these spaces and not feel, however way of kind of projecting this own internal thing that I'm dealing with. So I hope that is helpful, but I think that what it is for me is just always, when everything is gone, what's the next project? Just picking up and keep exploring, Even if people aren't paying attention, but also try to be honest with yourself too, because I think that soul-crushing critique is necessary at times, in intervals, as long as it's not too repetitious or too mean, but I think that some people will run from a very true critique that they know of their work, of maybe it's a little bit too, this other things that you maybe are wanting someone to tell you about your work, to be honest with yourself and figure out how you can address that and kind of push through that limitation.
Thank you so much. So you're gonna be signing the book at 5 today at your publisher stand, which is SE27 booth. Thank you so much for being with us, Rahiim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the Ice Talks continue tomorrow at 2 p.m. here. Bye.